So it doesn't really matter if you're independently publishing or you're a freelance creator or you're trying to get a creator owned deal. The one concept that you have to always keep your eye on in these deals is who owns what and who is getting paid for whatever it is that they own. If you can't tell in a contract who owns the actual underlying characters and stories and everything else, there's a good chance that you don't own it. If you can't tell how you're going to get paid, there's a very good chance you will not going to be paid. So you have to clarify that before you sign the contract. And if no one on the other side is willing or able to explain to you what you own or how you're going to get paid, then you have to be willing to walk away from that deal.
Gamal Hennessy, I appreciate you joining me. You're a lawyer and a writer, most recently of the business of the independent comic book publishing. I think I
Mm-hmm.
butchered that, a little bit of a tongue twister, but but you killed it on Kickstarter. It was around last Christmas time, so I wasn't able to back it myself, but I
Mm.
saw you killed it, and you're doing God's work. I think the business side and the contracting side as creatives, it's just it can be a nightmare. It can pull the right side of the brain against the left side of the brain, and it's hard to wrap your head
Mm-hmm.
around. I've done it a little bit on my own. I've written probably a dozen or so collaborative contracts for folks that I've hired. I mean,
Right.
so what do you think? What are the pitfalls in that? As somebody who would try to do it themselves, are there many pitfalls? I'm sure there's tons, but tell me a little
The
bit about
major,
that.
yeah, the major issue that you have to take a look at when you're thinking about writing your own contract is there's a lot of unintended consequences and ramifications that come from leaving certain concepts out or putting certain concepts in that aren't clear, because you may be running into a situation where you are writing a contract to protect yourself, but you actually put yourself in a worse position because what you wrote doesn't actually accurately reflect what it is that you meant to say. And then the legal implications of that, if there's a problem later on, is something that you can't, it's difficult to untangle it, especially if you're the one who wrote the contract, because in many cases, the people looking at whatever the dispute is will say, well, you wrote it, then whatever problems are with the contract, it's your problem because it's something that you wrote. And there's a lot of things that are not necessarily readily apparent or common sense when it comes to contracts, especially contracts about comics, because it's a very specific field of entertainment and intellectual property law that you can miss a lot of things simply by not being trained in it.
So what? Maybe let me backpedal a little bit. Can you just tell me about or us about your legal background, just really quick?
Sure, sure. I graduated law school way back in the 90s, and I started my first job. I was the general counsel for a Japanese animation and manga company. So we were licensing a lot of material from Japan, translating into the US, and then releasing it here and in Europe. So when Marvel decided they wanted to actually reach into the Japanese market and other international markets, they hired me away from the manga company, and it was my job to kind of manage those relationships as the international publishing manager for Marvel for about a year and a half, 2 years. And while I was there, one of the biggest things that I noticed was that I also worked with a lot of the writers and artists who are coming in to get deals with Marvel to work on a freelance basis. What I quickly understood was those people didn't actually have legal representation of their own. So they were being given fairly complex agreements that had long term ramifications, but they didn't even know what they were signing. So when I left Marvel, one of the things that I did was I started a practice called Creative Contract Consulting, which was initially designed just to help people in that position understand what it was they were giving up and what it was they were getting. I didn't because the nature of the leverage between someone like an emerging writer and Marvel was so huge, you didn't really expect to get any changes in the contract necessarily, but you did want them people to sign the contract with their eyes open. But as the technology changed and as the industry changed and more people had the opportunity to get their own work out there, my business changed so that now I am helping people form corporations, hire their own creative teams, work out distribution, and all those other pieces. And I did that for about 10 years and then realized that there was still a lot of aspects of the business that emerging writers and independent publishers and artists didn't really understand. So I was helping them with the legal part, but they were still struggling with the marketing and the distribution and the advertising and the sales and the project management pieces. So that's when I wrote The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing to kind of fill in the gaps that people may have, especially if they wake up one day and they say, okay, I'm going to make a comic or I'm going to publish a comic. And they're not even sure what that means. They can read this book and it will take you from start to finish, from the idea, I'm going to make comics, to the point where you have a long-term business model where you're producing comics on a regular basis and, you're in position to become the next IDW or Image or whatever.
Yeah, I glanced over the Kickstarter page and the index or the table of contents, and it looks like a one-stop shop for anybody looking to dip their toe into self-publishing and just any of that, the creative drive. Speaking of creative drive, so you're a novel writer as well, right? Mm-hmm. When did you get that? When did you get bit by that bug? Because I was noticing you've got the right side of your brain fighting against the left side of your brain, the analytical side where you are a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, and then the left side, you have this creative beast inside of you too.
Yeah, the thing about working at a place like Marvel or working with artists and writers on a regular basis, I think it is inevitable where you kind of get infected with that idea. It's like, well, I have it, especially when you see like people will come, you'll hear pitches for like amazing stories, and you'll hear pitches for stories that are like kind of ridiculous, and you're like, well, I can write something along those lines. And I think the pivotal point when I was at Marvel was that at that point, because they were just starting to get their feet under them in terms of the films, all of the editors from Marvel were sent out to Los Angeles to take a course in screenwriting from a gentleman named Robert McKee. And Robert McKee wrote a very good book on screenwriting called Story. And a good friend of mine at Marvel came back and said, you need to read this book. And once I read Story, then I said, okay, I can now write a novel. And it was that kind of transformative. Like once you close the book, you're like, I can write a novel now. So I wrote in 5 years, I think I wrote 6 novels. Yes, 6 novels. The only thing that I had written before that, I was in a previous life, I was heavily involved in nightlife in New York City. So I wrote a book about the nightlife, the business and culture of nightlife in New York City, and how beneficial it is for cities in general to kind of support their nightlife. So that my first book was a nonfiction book. The next 5 or 6 books I wrote were all fiction. And then I was planning on writing a comic, but that situation fell through. And then I started writing The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. So I don't know if when or if I'm going to get back to that comic book, that graphic novel, especially since right now I'm writing the follow-up book, which is a book called The Business of Freelance Comic Book Publishing, which will help everyone who is, trying to get into work for one of the major publishing houses or just work for independent creators. How do you actually build a career there? Because the business models are kind of different and the economics are a little bit different. So I'm writing a book from that perspective now, which will probably come out by New York Comic Con 2022.
Oof. So you are knee deep in that that book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's no time for comics. I mean, I'm sure you have little seeds and little tidbits of
Oh
story
yeah.
brainstorming, but you know, they'll come. I'm sure they'll come. So doing this channel and putting myself out there for kind of aggregating this type of information,
Hmm.
just that drive or that the focus needed to do that. I mean, you really have to be either a multitasker and just be able to just put one thing here and one thing there and be able to juggle different tasks, the creative task, the analytical task, and so on, which I think seems to be the theme that we've been going back and forth on here. If I could jump back into the contract stuff,
Hmm.
this is kind of a general or generic question, I think, but I don't think it's as obvious that most people would think. So why is it important to have a contract in play as opposed to something like a good faith, I guess, quote unquote, good faith contract, just based on verbal, phone calls, emails, and stuff like that?
Well, the you have two issues when you're talking about doing any kind of creative work without a contract. The short-term issue is you're it is going to be unclear because different people have different perspectives and different people's memories work in different ways. The people are not going to necessarily remember or understand what it is that they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it, how they're supposed to do it, and who actually owns what. So, especially in a industry like comics, where time is a very important factor because you can't, if you miss your street date, if you miss your order cutoff date, if you miss a lot of these dates, you can take a potentially great book and it will fail in the market, not because of the content of the book, but because you didn't put it out in the right time. So you need to kind of, once you actually decide this is when the book is going to come out, you have to stick to certain schedules. And it is important to for everyone to know what their roles and responsibilities are. And the easiest way to do that is with a written agreement to kind of lays everything out. The longer term issue, which is probably the more important issue when it comes to comics, especially modern comics, is it is very easy for people to start working together and making a comic when there are there are no stakes involved. The moment Netflix picks up the phone and calls and says, "Oh, we want to make Jupiter's Legacy or Lock and Key or Umbrella Academy," all of a sudden, no one will remember exactly who owned what in that deal, and everyone will, in their minds, consciously or subconsciously, think they own 75 to 100% of this idea because now there might be a couple $100,000 on the table. There might be a couple $1 million on the table if you're talking merchandising and cross promotions. If there's an agreement in place beforehand, everybody knows what they own. Everybody knows what they get. So when Netflix picks up the phone, you all go out and celebrate because all you have to do is tell them where to send the money. If you don't have a contract, that's when the struggle begins. And that struggle can destroy relationships, it can lead to lawsuits, it can actually ultimately destroy the underlying deal because companies that are going to do like major media productions, they need to be very clear about who owns what. And if you can't explain to them who owns what with the contract, they're going to pass because they don't want to get involved, entangled in those kind of media struggles. So if you have a contract in place, it's much easier to get work done in the beginning, and it's much easier if and when the project takes off, much easier to kind of get into that game and make some money there.
Sticking with that a little bit. So if you are, so say in the collaborative space, the contract between collaborators, what do you think is one important, the first thing that maybe comes to mind that a creator should not gloss over if they're reviewing their own contract?
Well, it's a two-part thing. You have to think about exactly how the potential revenue is going to be split between the parties. So let's say you have a writer and an artist, they're collaborating on a deal, and how are they going to split? Let's stick with the Netflix thing. How are they going to split the streaming TV revenue? Is it going to be a 50-50 split? Is it going to be more for the writer because he wrote the script? Is it going to be more for the artist because she designed the underlying material? And how are these splits going to be broken down based on what type of material was used? Because, for example, some collaboration teams don't feel comfortable doing a straight 50-50 split for something like merchandise, because the writer's role in actually creating the look of the characters was pretty much zero in create, character designs, layouts, things like that. So
Sure.
maybe in that the artist should get more because that's the material being used to create that particular product. Whereas if you're talking about a comic book being turned into, I don't know, a stage play, or a comic book being turned into a novel, then maybe the writer should get more of that because it's the actual script that is being more utilized than the look and feel of the characters that are being created. The other big piece that's related to that is how profit and revenue are defined. It is one thing to say, let's say a deal comes in for $10,000 and it's a 50-50 split. Well, both sides might be expecting $5,000, but might be costs that are taken off, what they call off the top. So you have the $10,000 might be the gross revenue that comes in. But if you guys are deducting things like production costs, printing costs, distribution costs, marketing costs, everything else, before you do that split, you might realize that at the end of the day, there may only be $2,000 left. And then you're splitting that. So, like I said, if you just have phone calls or emails going back and forth, it is very unlikely that you actually defined what the net revenue split was going to be and how that was going to be worked out. That is something that needs to actually be in the contract, along with the other big piece of it is ownership. Who actually owns what? When the copyright gets filed, whose name is going to go on it? When you're actually talking about who gets to make decisions about what goes on in the book, who gets to make those decisions? And if there's a dispute about what the direction of the book or how it's going to happen or any aspect of it, you need to have a mechanism in place to resolve those disputes in a way that doesn't derail the project.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a lot there, and you unpacked it and hit a lot of points. That was awesome. What about, so that was kind of the creative team contract. How about, so now that's settled and we take it to a publisher, the pitch is successful, the publisher presents us with a contract. Are there pitfalls or certain things, or maybe you could hit a few of the points like you just laid out with the collaborative contract on the publishing contract side?
Well, the publishing contract side, the most important piece there is going to be ownership and control. You have to understand what it is that you're giving up and what it is that you're getting, and then decide if that's a good deal for where you want to take this book. For example, if a publisher comes to you and says, we want to publish your book, you'll say, okay, great, we want a publisher to publish our book. And they give you a contract, and then you read it and you begin to understand that not only are they going to publish your book, but they're going to own the movie rights and the video game rights and the merchandising rights. And they are going to put themselves in a position where they have exclusive control over the characters and the sequels and the prequels. And they're in the position where you cannot get the rights to your comic book back under any circumstances. And they're not even obligated to publish your book. You quickly realize that that contract puts you in a position where you have basically given away ownership and control of your entire comic for nothing, because they may not give you any advance up front. So the idea that a publisher is giving you a publishing contract, you have to make sure that that publishing contract is really a publishing contract and not a transfer of ownership contract where you basically give away 3 or 4 years of work for nothing.
So, and we've all heard horror stories of publishers and bad deals that have gone on. Is there something, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like an exit clause or something that can be thrown in there that would allow a creative team, if the publisher just held on to the IP and didn't even print it, things that can pull, that might not be a time frame, that they can then pull the IP back?
Well, what you want to look at, because there are clauses. There are clawback, what they call a clawback clause, or reversion of rights clause that you can use to kind of get your rights back. But the better option, the better idea that I think a lot of comic book creators are nervous about using is saying no in the first instance. You want to actually understand where you want to go with your comic, with your publishing career, and then when you look at the contract, ask yourself, well, does this deal get me closer to where I really want to be? And if it doesn't, then there's no net downside in walking away from a bad deal. I think because most people who are in comics and making comics are doing it because they love comics, when someone gives them a deal, especially if they've been trying to shop their comic for a while, they are very eager to sign the first deal that is put in front of them. But the most power and the most leverage you're going to have is before you sign the deal. If you have the ability and I don't want to use the word courage because that makes it sound dramatic, but the courage to say, no, I'm not taking this deal, you put yourself in a much better position potentially, because if one publisher offers you a deal, then it is fairly likely that that is not going to be the only publisher in all of comics that's going to offer you a deal. There are about 300 different comic book publishers in America, not counting what's going on in Europe and South America and everything else. If one publisher offered you a deal, it is very likely that another publisher will offer you a deal that could be better than the first deal that you got. Even if no one else offered you a deal, one of the other reasons I made the business of independent comic book publishing is we are now living in an era where you can publish your own book, retain all the rights, make the process profitable and easier to understand, so that your only option is not taking a deal where you're losing ownership of everything. So I think that is, instead of trying to, now there's different levels of contracts. There are some contracts that are only mildly focused towards the publisher and detrimental towards you. And there are some contracts that are not even worth negotiating because they are so detrimental to your interests. And once you understand that, you can decide whether you want to negotiate with a publisher or not. But either way, you should know that in your back pocket, you could get another deal, or you can get the book out yourself. And then you don't have to you don't worry about rejecting a bad deal.
Yeah, that can be scary. I mean, I'll speak from my own personal experience getting one of the first things signed with a publisher. Your heart skips a beat. You're like, all right, someone's digging what I'm putting out. I can get it out there. I can start building my portfolio. Maybe you'll be more likely to pull the trigger on a crappier contract or gloss over a crappy term, especially if you don't understand it. I mean, I kind of shot myself in the foot, and I know other folks have done it. I think it's a tale as old as time, where the creators just want to jump in. But going back also to the crowdfunding aspect and the advent of crowdfunding, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, we can keep 100% of our rights, like you just laid out, and go forth and build something from the ground up. And that's just, I mean, amazing. I mean, that's where I started with my first, independent single issue floppies, years ago. And it's what people are doing, and now it's even what bigger publishers are doing. They're taking a lot of their IPs directly to Kickstarter first, maybe testing the waters or just using that as a secondary revenue stream, a little bit of another marketing stream. It's just, I mean, that's kind of taking over, it's just giving creators more tools to create. But then in the background is still the lingering, the contracts and things like that if they wanted to then pitch those books to publishers. So so let me ask you this. If a publisher, ABC Publishing, was going bankrupt and they had your IP and they had the rights to it, does that revert back to you in a case of bankruptcy?
And it all depends on what the contract says,
Right.
because usually anything in a contract, any deal can be negotiated. So in a lot of situations, if a company files for bankruptcy, that's one of the triggers for the reversion of rights to go back to you. Because what you don't want to happen is you don't want your book to become one of the assets that the company can use to try to get themselves out of bankruptcy. So if you've got a graphic novel with a publisher and the publisher suddenly goes bankrupt, what's going to happen is all of the assets of the company are going to be collected, and they're going to try to pay off as much of their debt as they can with the property that they have. You don't want your book, your IP, to be one of those things that they just have the ability to sell off. So you want to actually make sure that if, in the case of bankruptcy, the rights simply revert back to you without any trigger of you having to do anything or write any letters, because most comic book creators are not keeping track of the legal status of their publisher to know whether or not they are filing for bankruptcy. So you don't want to have to lose your rights because you didn't take an action that you were not keeping track of because that wasn't your job in the first place.
Right. No, that makes sense. Do you think granting a publisher the rights to your IP in perpetuity is ever a good idea?
It is. Oh well, it is a good idea. I always go back to, if you get something for what you give, then maybe it does make sense to sell it to them.
Okay.
I mean, if at a certain point a couple years ago, Mark Millar sold the rights to Millar World to Netflix. Now, I don't know if that deal was in perpetuity, but they gave him like $10 million up front. Well, maybe then they should take it, and it's fine. I mean, it's the kind of thing where if someone said to you, because there was a story in Forbes made a couple years ago that gave the dollar value, the market value of the idea of Batman. Not counting the books that were out, not counting the revenue stream. If you just walked into a bank and said, I own the idea of Batman, and you would get, they said you would get, I don't know, $450 million for that idea. Well, okay, if someone's going to give you that much money, give them the idea in perpetuity. It's fine. I don't, But if someone's asking you to give them the rights to your character in perpetuity and there's no advance at all, and then if you look at the contract and you can't even figure out how you're going to get paid, it's probably because you're not going to get paid. And now you just gave away something that is very valuable to you for nothing. So I would never say you can't ever sell your rights in perpetuity. I would simply say figure out what is it you're getting, and if the value of that to you is enough for you to give away those rights, then give away those rights.
Yeah, I think that's like everything. It's a mixture of grays and gray tones, right? It's not black and white. It's not a blanket. No, never do this. To your point, yeah, if Mark Millar is selling Millar World to Netflix for $1 quadrillion, I mean,
then it's fine.
Perpetuity. Sure. You could take all my ideas for the rest of my life.
Yeah,
right.
I'll even give you the new ideas I haven't even made up yet. Sure.
We'll throw them in. Yeah.
Yeah,
You can have my kids' ideas too down the road.
sure. You can even have the kids. Take the kids.
Oh man, that's funny. So what was I looking at? I think I was looking on Facebook really quick. So you graduated Brooklyn Tech. It was back in the '90s. I think you were saying you went to law school.
I graduated.
We don't have to put a date on it.
Yeah, I graduated Brooklyn Tech. I want to say it was '88. I graduated college in '93, and I graduated law school in '96. So I pretty much, and I think I went straight from law school into the comic book industry, which is you have. If you're a person who has been reading comics since you were like 4 or 5, it is difficult to describe how good it feels to go straight from law school into comics, and that's your first job. And it's really the only job that I've had. So, yes, for like 20,
it's beautiful.
Yeah, 20-something years I've been in comics now.
What was the manga company that you started with prior to Marvel?
It was a company called Central Park Media. It was very big into, well, we had a couple of films that were award-winning even before manga, because anime and manga in the late 90s was a very niche product. You didn't have the kind of widespread distribution of manga that you now have in places like Barnes and Noble and Crunchyroll and
Oh yeah,
all that.
I was in Barnes and Noble. Sorry to cut you off recently, and I hadn't been in a while due to COVID. But I walk in there, and then it refreshed my memory that there's a whole section, like the manga was just about equal to, if not more than, the other graphic novel and comic book section. I think it's because manga, specifically maybe Viz Media, make up more of the graphic novel sales than or comparable to DC, Marvel combined. So yes, manga now is just massive, I'm sure, especially compared to then.
Yeah, back then it was very small. It was very niche. But those fans were, who I guess they're parents now, were very passionate about the books that they were following and the anime that they were watching. So that company was around, I want to say, until 2005, 2006, and then they stopped distributing. But I had been gone for like 5 or 6 years by then.
Did they have any major IP that is still around today, or they were kind of just a smaller press?
Yeah, they had a lot of the early, in addition to like the mainstream content that they had a lot of hentai. So anyone who goes into a rabbit hole of like hentai and things like that will inevitably run into Central Park Media products. Inevitably.
All hentai roads lead back to Central Park Media.
Exactly. Sooner or later, you're going to be watching some Central Park. If there's like tentacles involved or anything like that, yeah, and demons, yeah, that was us.
That's funny. So did you grow up in Brooklyn or in one of the boroughs?
Yeah, I was born in the Bronx. I grew up in Queens. High school was in Manhattan. College was in Manhattan. And then law school was in Manhattan. So, the whole time.
City kid. Nice.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I grew up in Brooklyn myself, and then I think about 2003, 4, 5-ish, I moved out to New Jersey, like central Jersey, so that's where I've been ever since.
Yeah, and you have a lot more space now.
Oh yeah, a good amount of space. Yeah, the backyard and not as much noise and all that good stuff. Are you in the city? Where do you live now, if you don't mind me asking?
I still live in New York. I live in Queens now.
Okay, you're in Queens. Okay, cool. You might see it more often than me, but I've definitely heard the offer of exposure as payment to maybe from writers to artists, or maybe from smaller publishers to a collaborative team. Is that something? Do you still see that on your end?
I still see it, and I almost always caution my clients against accepting exposure as a form of payment, or even offering exposure as a form of payment, because exposure is Exposure is a myth. There is no such thing, especially when you're talking about a situation where, because exposure as payment hinges on several different factors that do not make sense logically. The factors are: one, the book that you're working on is guaranteed to be a success. And since no book is guaranteed to be a success, that statement is false in the first instance. Second, that the book will be so successful that your name will be associated with this book and then people will want to hire you. That is also not necessarily correlated, because a very successful book doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to know who made the book. For example, Saga was extremely successful. I have no idea who the inker on Saga was or who the letterer on Saga was. I just know Saga was really successful. So the idea that exposure is going to get me more work doesn't logically follow. And three, if you're actually if you are willing to not get paid for the first job, there's nothing that's saying the next person who wants to hire you is going to offer you a lot of money. He may offer you the same amount, zero. So now you have set the precedent of not being paid for your work. And in the 21st century, where everyone has a platform, everyone has social media, if your only goal is to get your name out into the industry, you will be much better served just making your own book. Now you don't have to take exposure as a form of payment. Now, that's having said all of that and really like taking a huge swipe at the idea of exposure. Exposure is not the same as credit, because you should always get credit for the work that you do, no matter what it is that you're doing in a comic. So if you're the colorist for a comic, your name should be put on the masthead with the colorist, like everything else, because over time you could use your credit to build your portfolio that you can actually then take out and get more work. People like Jim Lee and Frank Miller, they started out as freelancers for Marvel and DC, and they got credit, and it was from that credit that they were able to leverage their own creator-owned books and their own films and all the other stuff that they did. But they didn't just get their name on the book. They got their name on the book and they got a page rate, which is what I advise most of my clients to get.
Right, I would say at minimum, right? Or if we substituted the page rate for a split of the royalties
Yes.
or the IP, there's
Mm,
multiple
absolutely.
avenues, and it all depends on what works for the team at the time.
Hmm.
But I think even as independent creators, if you're doing a book and the goal is you're splitting the royalties, that still is a little bit, who's to say it'll get picked up, or who's to say the crowdfunding campaign will be a success. So you still may, I guess you got to do your own homework, right, and research and figure out if the project is something worth putting that risk, because there's still a little bit of a risk factor involved with solely a royalty or IP split.
Yeah, that is the one of the things that, as a freelance comic book creator, you have to look at the potential of a particular book and say to yourself, well, if I work on this book, A, can I actually live with the idea that the book may not make any money? And if you're so enamored with the idea of the book or working on the book that you want to be involved in it just for the chance to make money, then okay. Then you know what you're getting into, and that's fine. But you're not still not working for exposure. You're working for a chance to get some revenue. And
Right.
if you're working on a book where you're almost positive there's going to be revenue down the line, it may make more sense to take a piece of that later than a flat fee up front. For example, if you found yourself as the designer for that Keanu Reeves book Berserker. Okay, Berserker's gonna make money. So just if they're trying to offer you percentages, just take that, because you know that's going to make some money. That's fine. And the other thing is, if you are especially if you're a freelancer, you have multiple projects that you're working on, it might make sense to get a couple of them that you think have long-term potential and be involved in those from an ownership standpoint. because you know you have other jobs that are paying your bills on a week to week, month to month basis, so that there's at least you have something out there that has like it would be a long term investment. The same way you don't necessarily know if the stock that you're buying today is ever going to, you know, become like Amazon. You don't necessarily know if this book is going to hit or that book's going to be made into a TV show. But if you hedge your bets and balance it out, a lot of jobs you take, you get cash up front, but a couple of them you have in your back pocket. You own a piece of them just in case it blows up. You're there for the party.
Oh, well said, well said. So I think I think we hit on a few of these aspects of this last question I want to ask you. But is there a single piece of language in contracts throughout the history of comics that you think has damaged or hurt creators like over any other bit of language?
I want to say it is not a specific bit of language, it is a concept. And the concept is that of ownership. If you are creating intellectual property as a writer or as an artist or as anyone else involved in the creative process, when you do that, you are creating something that you legally own. But it is extremely easy for you to sign away that ownership in a contract or give away that ownership in the way you're doing business, that you are hurting yourself on both a short term and a long term basis. So it doesn't really matter if you're independently publishing or you're a freelance creator or you're trying to get a creator owned deal or you're doing, licensing of comic book properties. The one concept that you have to always keep your eye on in these deals is who owns what and who is getting paid for whatever it is that they own. If you can't tell in a contract who owns the actual underlying characters and stories and everything else, there's a good chance that you don't own it. If you can't tell how you're going to get paid, there's a very good chance you will not going to be paid. So you have to clarify that before you sign the contract. And if no one on the other side is willing or able to explain to you what you own or how you're going to get paid, then you have to be willing to walk away from that deal knowing that you can get a better deal or put the book out yourself knowing that you can actually keep all of the rights as long as you're willing to do the work that is not fun necessarily in making comics. Project management, marketing, advertising, sales, revenue distribution, printing. None of those things are necessarily fun. But to get the book to the people and get the money for the book, those are the pieces. If you're willing to be comfortable with those pieces, you are in a much better position.
Yeah, those bits are the bits that people don't tell you about, or you don't think about when you dip your toe into comics, and they're all a
Exactly.
necessary evil, along with social media and the networking game and things like that. Gamal Hennessy, man, I appreciate your time. I think you can do a show where you talk hours and hours on this, and maybe even an audio book on your version of one of your books. Appreciate your time. Please let us know where we can find all of the things you're working on.
Okay. The name of the company is Creative Contract Consulting. So you can find my website at creativecontractconsulting.com. That's all one word. And if that's too long to remember, that's fine. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn under my name. That's GamalHennessy. And there's also a Facebook group that I run called the Business of Comic Book Publishing. And there we have we have about 2,500 creators and other professionals in the industry who talk about trends in the industry. They share their work, they announce their Kickstarters, they talk about all the different pieces that are not specifically related to the artistic side of comics. So you feel free to join us there. and participate in the discussion.
Yeah, I'm a member of that group. It is a wealth of knowledge, and there's always things coming in, little tips, pieces of advice. Once again, man, I'd love to have you back on. I'm sure we can continue talking and touch on little pieces of advice. And thanks again, man. I'll talk to you.
All right. All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.